This is our 258th, 57th talk on Common Core in the last 16 months in 38 states, so we've done a lot of this. So what I'd like to do is give you today a very good overview of not just what it is, but the hows, the whys, and the wherefores. Why is it being done? What comes with Common Core? Whenever you get these big government programs, they don't just come by themselves. There's always things attached to them, as we can see now through the healthcare law. Now that the healthcare law has been passed, pretty much everything's healthcare, right? They can get their hands on every aspect of your life, from guns to what your kids are going to eat in the high schools. And that's what's going to happen with Common Core as well. So by way of beginning, I like to define Common Core, so we're all on the same page. Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math. Those are already in your schools. All the other subject areas in the curriculum will be lined up with Common Core, right? A set of national standards for English and math. Science is on the way, social studies, everything will be ultimately Common Core aligned. And why do they call them the Common Core State Standards? That would lead you to believe that the states had a meaningful role to play in this. They did not have that. Why do they call it that? And I'm sure if any of you have dealt with your school administrators or some of your politicians in the state, they'll tell you, this was led by the states, this was led by the governors, never done. And I'll prove that to you in a moment. Every single slide you're going to see today is actually going to be documented moving forward, which means I'll show you exactly where we got it from. And when we're done, we'll give them to you. You can have all this information, because you should verify what I'm telling you. You don't know who I am. You shouldn't trust me. Go ahead and verify them, and if you do that, then the only thing I would ask you to do is hold your school administrators, hold your politicians accountable in the same way. When they tell you something like Common Core is state-led, ask them how they know that. I'll show you how I know it wasn't. They can't. What you hear again and again from the people who support Common Core is bullet points, talking points. And as a university professor, I can't do that. I can't just make a statement and not document it. All you have from the people who support this are undocumented statements. So if it's not state-led, and why do they call it? When you've been paying attention to government, big government, regardless of who's in charge of it for the last 30, 40 years, you know, right, that whenever big government cedes something to itself that doesn't belong to it, they always give it really catchy names, right? Why did they call the healthcare law the Affordable Care Act? Right? Did you believe it was affordable before? Or now, for that matter? Right? And so that's what we do. They call them the state standards because people who support it can walk around saying that this was a state-led operation. Where'd we get them? Actually, the standards were written and copyrighted by two Washington lobbyist groups. Two unelected, unaccountable lobbyist groups who, moms and dads in Georgia, if you, as people across the state, are already doing, if you get to the point where your state doesn't want this, moms and dads, how do you get a hold of these people? Here's the actual Common Core copyright. This is absolutely staggering to me. The people who own this educational paradigm, this transformation of American education, it's not the Department of Education, it's not the federal government, it's not the governors, it's not the states, it's not the teachers or the teachers' unions, and it's certainly not the moms and dads. The people who own this are two Washington lobbyist groups. The NGA Center and the CCSSO, these are the organizations that own it. How in the world, who allowed them to do this? Public education is public because it belongs to us. These are our kids. Who allowed these people, none of whom you've ever heard of, who have no accountability to taxpayers or voters, who put them in charge of this? What allows them to do such a thing? And you go back, the two organizations in question are the National Governors Association, the NGA. That's why people will tell you it's state-led. Well, the governors did this. First of all, the National Governors Association is a lobbying group. It's not a governors meeting group where governors get together and solve problems. If you go to their own website, the NGA is an organization that puts governors, politicians, and their aides in touch with activists and lobbyists to help shape policy. I'll prove to you that, well, before I prove that, let me ask you this. As far as the governors go, I really do wish the governors had done it. I wish 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. Would they have been a disaster? Yes. But you can always unelect a governor, right? You have some accountability, but ask yourself, what qualifies your governor to write education standards? I have arguably the most conservative governor in the country in Scott Walker in Wisconsin. He ain't qualified to write standards. Nobody is. None of these governors are. But at least if the governors had done this, you'd have some recourse. Let me prove to you the governors didn't do it. Does anybody know who the sitting chair of the National Governors Association was while much of Common Core was being implemented?
Mike Huckabee.
Not Mike Huckabee. Was he involved? Over the last couple of years, the person in charge was Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma. She's the one. And 2 months ago, Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma, pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core and had very nasty things to say about the fact that the states weren't consulted about it. So again, if the NGA is behind this, if this is all the governors, it doesn't make a lot of sense that the one governor in charge of the NGA just pulled her state out. Right? So this was not state-led. It was not run by the governors. 2 Washington lobbyist groups. And in these 2 Washington lobbyist groups, 5 people wrote the standards. If you're taking notes, a name you should write down is Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N. Joy is with the Heartland Institute in Chicago, and Joy has written the definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core, 5 of them. Chief among them is a man by the name of David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. David Coleman, the Huffington Post calls him the most powerful educational administrator that nobody's ever heard of. Coleman has never been elected to any public office. David Coleman has never been a classroom teacher. He has no experience. He was put in charge of the Common Core state standards. He was the chief architect of the standards, the man mostly responsible for them. And no sooner did David Coleman write these standards than he immediately left Common Core. And he became the president of the college boards, where he now gets to rewrite your ACTs and your SATs. The exams your kids are going to have to take to get into college. This man who wrote the Common Core is now in charge of that. The word I use for this is banana republic. This doesn't happen in constitutional republics. These people are utterly off the grid. This is a takeover. It's a coup, right? It's a takeover of public education by people you've never heard of, by people who have no accountability to you, by people who don't even have the experience or the background to be able to do this. And it is really amazing that no sooner did Coleman do this than now he's president of the college boards, where he's implementing his program. Oh, and by the way, as president of the college boards, David Coleman is also now overseeing the rewriting of all the AP courses your kids are going to have to take. So AP History is the first one that just got done. Staggering rewrite of American history. A vicious, anti-American, dishonest account of the origins, the nature, the functions. Capitalism. Your kids will be learning that free market capitalism is nothing but an oppressive system, a colonialist system, an imperialist system. There is nothing redeeming about the nature of your government, about the people who live in this country, or about the history of America. And yet, the same guy who wrote the standards is the same guy who's rewriting the college boards, is the same guy who's rewriting the AP tests. So these 2 Washington lobbyist groups did this. David Coleman is the architect. Who paid for it all? That would be the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Way back in 2009, Gates put up about $150 million to pay these 2 lobbyist groups to write the standards. As you sit here today, Gates has spent over $6 billion on Common Core. $6 billion. All of that has gone to paying off educational groups to support it. All of that money has gone to advertise and propagandize for Common Core. There's not a single major educational organization in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid to do so. Before the standards were even written, Gates had written multiple million-dollar checks to the National PTA. And the Parent Teachers Association, whose job it is to look after kids, before they'd even seen the standards, they were going around advocating for them in the states because they were paid to do so. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core without even being asked to do so in the very first year they could? Could it be that the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the largest Catholic watchdog for Catholic schools, they've received hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from the Gates people. All of these 501c3 groups, like ALEC, Achieve, Inc., the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, most of which are subsidized by people like Bill Gates and people like George Soros, right? These educational organizations whose job it is not to educate our kids better, but to turn our education system more political, more useful, particularly for the left. They're the companies that are all supporting this, and they're the ones who've been paid millions by Gates, billions now, to advertise for this. That's how you got it. And nobody even really disputes this. That's the irony. They'll tell you it's state-led, but when you ask a superintendent, explain to me how you know it's state-led. Well, because the state told me so, right? That's the only answer you're going to get. They've got no evidence for it. So, having said all that, and we should be absolutely outraged. There's that copyright. How in the world can, say what you will about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, say what you will. It had a hearing, didn't it, in the House, in the Senate, before the Supreme Court? Like it or not, there was some accountability, some electoral process that took place. Some voters were at least able to submit their concerns. This was never done with Common Core. Nobody anywhere has had a chance to vote on this. Legislatures didn't get to discuss this before your state took it. It wasn't put up to a referendum of the people. Teachers weren't brought in and consulted about it. And yet that's how you have it. Having said all that, there's no way Bill Gates, even with all his billions, could have put it in your schools. There's no way that David Coleman could have forced this in your public schools. How'd it get there? There's only one entity on earth that could have put this in your public schools. That's the federal government. The federal government controls education through the Department of Education. This would not be in your schools if they didn't put it there. This is how you know it's not state-led. And how did the federal government put it in your schools? How many of you have heard of the Race to the Top program? All right. That's a federal program, isn't it? That's the federal program that came about in 2009 when the president was stimulating things. Remember when we were stimulating banks and car companies? Well, he also, in conjunction with Arne Duncan at the Department of Education, he also wanted to stimulate public education. So he set aside billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that went directly to state education departments, provided you apply for and win Race to the Top grant money. That's how 44 states in America got Common Core. Simply by taking Race to the Top money, your state was obligated to accept the Common Core standards when they were finally written. So you took certain millions from the federal government, and when you took it, simply by virtue of taking that money and signing that contract, you were mandated to take the Common Core standards. So how do you call this state-led? Federal government bribed 44 states to take a set of curriculum standards that nobody had seen. Oh, and if this is state-led, then shouldn't states be able to walk away from it? If this is state-led, shouldn't the states who don't want it anymore get it? Remember when Georgia tried to get out of it last summer? Remember that, summer before last, excuse me. And the feds came down and threatened to withhold the entire federal education budget from the state of Georgia. Remember that? That's not state-led. You're bribing states to take it, and then you're blackmailing states to try to get out of it. And you make the argument that this is state-led? It's not state-led. The federal government put it in your schools. Why? And you can say, well, why? I don't understand. This sounds conspiratorial. If the federal government wanted to take over education, why didn't they just do it like they did health care? Because legally they could not. 3 different federal statutes dating back to 1965 prohibit the federal government of the United States from creating national standards or a national curriculum. They legally could not do it. That's why they did it this way. The 5 individuals who wrote Common Core for these 2 lobbyist groups, all deep-pocket money bundlers for the president, all intimately associated with both Arne Duncan at the Department of Education and President Obama's campaigns. These people were put there to do the job that the government couldn't do. That's why you get this sham copyright. The only purpose of this copyright is to try to indemnify them from getting sued for illegally taking over public education. And after 5 years, I don't know why it took so long, but after 5 years, we now have the first state governor, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana, who is now suing the federal government because what they did here is illegal. And 16 state governors right now are currently considering joining that lawsuit against the federal government, right? That's where you sit with this. And it gets even deeper than that. The 2 chief lawyers at the Department of Education, the 2 lawyers at the Department of Ed back in 2009, who were in charge of making sure that the federal government complied with the law when it came to education, they both labeled Common Core a federal takeover of education. As 2 scholars, McGroarty and Robbins, put it, in imposing the Common Core standards and the aligned tests on the states, the federal government is violating 3 statutes and has put America on the road to a national curriculum. And that's the second thing, by the way. If people want to keep making this argument to you that this argument that the standards are state-led, well, now you know they're not. But this also proves it. The only thing we have to measure these broad national standards is the national tests. Georgia, your kids are going to start getting their tests this year. You're just about to have them. All that information from the national tests, it reports directly back to the federal government. It doesn't report back to the state of Georgia. It doesn't report back to your teachers. Your teachers will not get to see which questions your kids got wrong in your classrooms. How in the world are these tests going to help your kids learn anything? But you get it, right? Whoever controls the national test controls what your teachers are able to teach. If the only way we have to measure the standards are these broad national tests, and if the only thing that we really have to evaluate your teachers now is whether or not they get to the standards, they get your kids to the standards, then pretty much who controls the tests controls the curriculum. And that's the federal takeover aspect of that. The federal government does not want you or your teachers or your state or your local communities determining what it is that your kids learn. The feds and the feds alone want that right and that authority. And so they're going to punish teachers who can't get their kids to those standards, and schools who can't get their kids. Why are your teachers so hesitant to speak out about this? Why are your because they're absolutely being browbeaten. We've got the superintendent of schools, where I just came from in Alabama. Superintendent of schools at a public meeting on film basically told any teacher in his schools in Alabama who did not want to conform to this, he would show them to the door. So you're threatening teachers. You're either going to like this or you're going to keep your mouth shut. This is strong arming. This is extortion. This is what you've seen them do when they put it in. It's blackmail and it's bribery. What kind of educational system starts with those premises? Here are the two lawyers I was talking about. With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and tests will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program and raising a fundamental question about whether or not the department is exceeding its statutory boundaries. That's the two lawyers in charge of this. And you know, 257 talks, 38 states. There's no argument. They won't stand up here and debate it. You know how many times we begged them to come and debate this? They won't do it. And by the way, there are hundreds of people in Georgia, thousands of people across the country who are doing this kind of anti-Common Core educational work. You could pretty much any weekend of the year, any week of the year, you could find somebody in your state who's talking about this. Where do you go to listen to the people who think it's good? Why aren't they out there talking about this? How come there's nobody nationally outside of the paid superintendents at the occasional board meeting? How come there are no Common Core experts doing what we're doing, countering the evil lies we're telling? If what we're saying is so bogus, it should be the easiest thing in the world to refute it. But they don't show up and talk to you. They don't show up and explain to you why we're wrong, because they can't after 5 years. That's the situation you're in. The two chief lawyers at the Department of Ed said it's a violation of the Constitution. And so the only meaningful argument, I don't get arguments. What we get, all of us who've been in, I know Ann's felt this, people in Georgia felt this, anybody who opposes Common Core is just a right-winger. Have you heard that? Yeah. It's just the Tea Party, it's fringe groups, right? And how did we get to the point where the Tea Party, we draw no distinction anymore between the Tea Party and the Ku Klux Klan. Have you noticed that? How the Tea Party has been painted? Right? So when they call you Tea Party or tinfoil hat, teabaggers, right-wingers, that right there instigates the notion that we shouldn't take you seriously. So what I've done in my talk is I'm going to spend about a half an hour showing you why Common Core won't work, exclusively from liberal progressive voices. It's a weird world we live in, isn't it? Where your facts only matter if you have the right politics. We've been saying what I'm going to show you for 2 years now. But being labeled right-wing tinfoil hat wearers, nobody's obliged to listen. Okay, fair enough. How do you then fight the fact that an increasingly long list of radical progressive liberals hate this as much as conservatives do? Here's the first one. This is the New York State Teachers Union. Is there any way you can twist the New York State Teachers Union into some conspiratorial right-wing group? And I want you to notice the date of this. This is January of this year. All of these slides come from this year. Now that schools and unions and teachers are beginning to see it in action, they hate it. In Alabama alone, 70% of moms and dads in Alabama are against Common Core. Teachers, in 1 year, teacher disapproval went from 20% to 64% in 1 calendar year. And keep in mind that in most states where the teachers are that upset, they haven't even seen the first testing yet. You think it's bad now? Wait till that kicks in. So New York. The board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday unanimously voted to withdraw support for Common Core and declared no confidence in the state education commissioner. In other words, the state education commissioner of New York, who single-handedly brought it to the state, the union wants him fired. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state, is also asking the State Board of Regents to remove Commissioner John King from office. And although the union previously backed the standards, the union says it will not support Common Core either as implemented or interpreted. Not the way you put it in, and not if you fix it. Just get rid of it. That's the teachers' union. And here's a remarkable thing. Why are your teachers so unable to speak out? Because the state teachers' unions want it, most of them. And that's a big deal to teachers. And then the state administrators want it, right? So if you're a teacher and you don't like this, what are you going to do? Speaking out, you're defying both your union and the state that employs you. But in New York, where the teachers' union pulled out or demanded a pullout, teachers are speaking out in the tens of thousands. Because now they know if the state tries to unjustly fire them for being against Common Core, as teachers in Alabama are being threatened with, then the union will have their back. That's a serious thing. And I bet you, Georgia, you know, the only teachers you hear from on Common Core are the ones who like it, because the ones who do get patted on the head. The ones who do get showcased. The ones who do get smiles and smiley faces from both the union and the government. If you can shake one of those two things loose, the legislature or the union, the teachers will be free to speak out, and Common Core will die the ignominious death it deserves to die. But you're not there yet. Got to keep moving towards that. How about, if that's not enough for you, how about the right-wing organization known as the NEA? How about the largest uber right-wing organization in this country, the National Teachers Union, right? Here's what the NEA said, and notice the deadline, notice the date there, February 2014. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for Common Core, labeling the rollout completely botched. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, "The standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input." That's the irony, isn't it? The teachers didn't write Common Core. The teachers don't write the tests. The teachers don't even get to see the tests. The teachers don't get the specific results from the tests. And you're going to hold your teachers accountable. Let me defend teachers. As a 22-year teacher myself, it is not acceptable to hold teachers accountable for tests they did not write, they do not get input on, they can't revise, they can't work with. You understand, the unions are not pulling out for the same reason you and I want out. You get that? The unions are not suddenly, they didn't have a come to Jesus moment. They're not suddenly on our side, but they noticed something. They figured it out, that Common Core, if it gets fully implemented, is going to take control of teachers away from them and give it to the feds. They don't seem terrible. They weren't worried about it when it was the students, your kids, who were being pulled to the federal government. But when their teachers are, hey, politics makes strange bedfellows, right? How about the nation's second largest teachers union? And by the way, this is the American Federation of Teachers. This is considered the more liberal of the two, more progressive of the two unions. This is the union you join if the NEA is not liberal enough for you. And keep in mind that the NEA is, now that the UAW has had its knees capped by the federal government, this is the NEA is the most powerful political union in the country. They spend more money on political activism than any other union in the country, and all that activism goes to Democrats and left-wing causes. They're the group, the NEA, that when Governor Walker in Wisconsin took on the teachers union and won and got recalled, the NEA dumped about $250 million of teachers' taxpayer dues to fight him. Is that a good use of your money, Georgia teachers? Right? So this organization, this union, is even more progressive than that one. Notice the date, July of 2014. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention by announcing a step back from support for Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants for teachers to criticize the standards or to write entirely new ones. Do you understand now why teachers are speaking out? Because not only will the AFT get your back if you get fired, they're going to pay you, well, it's ironic. You're paying all that money in dues to the AFT, and they'll give you some of it back to criticize Common Core. It's a heck of a racket, right? The AFT's Executive Council also introduced a resolution declaring that the standards may have had noble intentions, but they have fallen short. Why? Due to outside meddling, Bill Gates, David Coleman, and an inordinate focus on standardized tests that tell us nothing. How about this? Common Core has also seen other opposition on the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who have called themselves, they're progressives after all, the Badass Teachers Association. Now that number is up to about 150,000. And the badass teachers, by the way, and you're working with them in Alabama, Ann, right? Alabama is not a badass teacher. Actually, not Alabama. Ann is not a badass teacher. All right, but her groups, her conservative groups, are working with these lefties because they have the same ambition. In fact, the Badass Teachers Organization was founded almost exclusively to fight things like Common Core. And one of the things that the extreme left on this and the extreme right both agree on with Common Core is what it does, how dangerous it is for special needs kids, for kids that are already struggling, for kids that are already behind the 8 ball, many of whom no doubt are inner city minority kids in big cities, right? These kids are going to be absolutely trampled over by Common Core. How about my personal favorite? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? How about President Obama's own backyard? How about the most radical progressive state teachers union in the country? You know who their Martin Luther King Day speaker was this year for the elementary school kids? The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Remember him? All right? This is not a conservative entity. The woman on the picture there, that's Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. She is now running for mayor of Chicago. And she's running, get this, to the left of Rahm Emanuel. See, did you know there was anything to the left of Rahm Emanuel? But maybe dryer lint and, can you squeeze anything to the left of Rahm? Well, she's going to squeeze herself in there, right? So this is not, again, a right-wing organization. And everything I'm about to read you is a direct quote from Karen Lewis. I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy. This is the data mining. And an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy. You keep hearing, if you're paying attention, you see what we're doing? We're going one by one through a series of pro-Common Core myths. They're state-led, they're not federal. The governors did this. How about this one? How about this one, right? That we have state and local control in Georgia. The worst aspects of this, well, yeah, your Georgia administrators will admit we've seen some horrible things with Common Core. They've pulled some pretty shocking assignments out of some Georgia classrooms, haven't they? They pulled some really scandalous sexuality junk out of some of your kids' classrooms, haven't they? But your administrators will tell you that's not the fault of the standards. That's the fault of textbook company. We have local control. The worst parts of this is never going to happen here. Really? Listen to what Mrs. Lewis says. An overreach of federal power into your ability to control your kids' education, state educational autonomy. How about this? Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration. Any teachers here? Well, you tell me if I'm wrong, ladies, okay? As a 22-year teacher, aren't there days when you have to throw the stinking curriculum out? Aren't there days when you got 22 faces staring at you with blank expressions? Yes. Days when you have to completely do something different, you have to start over, you have to recalibrate. Creativity. The best teachers are the ones who can figure out what the kids sitting next to them, in front of them need. Not some Washington brain deciding on one way to do it for all kids every day. It doesn't make any sense. Your kids aren't the same kids. Common Core eliminates creativity and impedes collaboration. We also know that high-stakes standardized tests are designed to rank and sort our children and they contribute significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in American schools. And she's right just like the lawyers were right. She's right just like the New York teachers were right. This is discrimination. This is racism. You're going to create one abstract standard that every kid has to meet. Then you're going to go into inner city schools where kids are already struggling, and you're going to force a standard on them that doesn't fit them. You're going to take away money and opportunity and creativity in teachers to get the kids who need the most flexibility into the tiniest box. Good luck with that. This is why the badass teachers are opposed to this, as well as every right-wing organization I've ever encountered. They're opposed to it for the same reasons. The Chicago Teachers Union, not only did Karen Lewis say what she just said, but the entire union crafted 30 different anti-Common Core resolutions. I can't read them all to you, they're online. I'll just show you a couple. Here's one of the resolutions. The CTU resolution declares that, quote, instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom professionals who understand the context and interests of their students. Who should be in charge of what goes on in your schools? Education professionals, teachers, professors, educators. That wasn't done with Common Core. They had nothing to do with this. And how about this? The education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. On top of everything else, I want you to remember the very first people who told you how developmentally inappropriate Common Core is, how it doesn't fit our kids, how it is in its own way abusive by forcing kids into things and holding them accountable for things that they have no ability to understand. It's the Teachers Union, the Chicago one. Oh, and by the way, I want to emphasize this. You know who these people are, Chicago Teachers Union? Do you know this is the same school, same Teachers Union, the Chicago Union, that 5 years ago approved a curriculum alteration that would allow the teaching of masturbation techniques to 5-year-olds. Oh my gosh. And they're telling you that Common Core is inappropriate. What does that suggest to you about the nature of this beast? Right? How about this? Common Core standards were developed by non-practitioners. This is all supposed to be teacher-led, right? State-led, teacher-led. It was developed by non-practitioners. Who did it? Test and curriculum publishers. They were big players in this. And educational reform foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, Achieve Inc., ALEC, Aspire, a whole range of them. The union's resolution says that as a result, quote, the standards better reflect the interests and priorities of corporate education reformers than the best interests and priorities of students. That's what you got going on here. How about the liberal, exceedingly liberal news magazine Salon.com, one of the more progressive websites and media conglomerate associations in the country? And how about their radically liberal editor, Michael Mazenko? The whole thing is a direct quote from his article, note the date, July of this year. The underreported story about Common Core is the millions of dollars to be made developing and selling educational materials and tests linked to the new standards. Ready for myth number 5? How many of you have heard this? They're just a set of standards. They're not curriculum. How many of you have heard that? That to me, that is the most, as a teacher, that's the most aggravating lie they tell. Because your teachers all went home one June morning at the end of a school year, and you showed up back in the fall, and all your books were gone. And you were either replaced with Common Core books, or you had these, even worse, these handouts and these worksheets that came right off the internet that moms and dads never got to saw. How did your teachers learn how to teach Common Core? There were no manuals. The only thing they had was the pedagogy, the textbooks, the worksheets, the curriculum that was in the schools to help them learn it. And who produced all that? The same educational companies like Pearson Publishing who worked with the people who wrote the standards to put the stuff together. There are no standards without the pedagogy they've given you. You want to teach Common Core, but you don't want to do it the Common Core way, good luck. There's nothing you can use but what the Common Core people have handed you. That's the idea that you can separate these two things is absurd. You can't separate them. And it's the liberal Mazenko who's going to point that out. The underreported story about Common Core is the millions to be made developing and selling because your teachers don't know how to do it. Hey, look, can I tell you this? And tell me if you think I'm wrong about if you have a different experiences. You go talk to your teachers about this. They don't know what Common Core is. They can't tell you why. They can't tell you how. They can't tell you who. Your principals don't know the vaguest place where. Your superintendents don't know where it came from. They don't know what it is. And God knows if your teachers don't know, your politicians have no idea either. And I've testified before 14 different state legislatures about this, and nobody, after 3 and 4 and 5 years of this in their state schools, nobody can tell you what it means at all. Mazenko says, despite claims by Common Core advocates that standards are not curriculum, school districts have figured out, are realizing that they need to spend money on new materials and training to meet the expectation of the standards, especially if those schools are required to use standardized tests to measure them, and all your Georgia schools are. Without doubt, the implementation of Common Core will cost millions, hundreds of millions. How about this? Your Department of Education last year, your federal Department of Education, paid private companies like Pearson Publishing $350 million to write test curriculum and materials to teach your teachers how to teach Common Core. You understand that Pearson Publishing's job is to produce that stuff anyway? So your federal government is paying a company to do what it otherwise would have done, that's what its business is, then allowed Pearson to sell all that junk to states like Georgia, and Pearson kept all the money. Why is your federal government paying a particular company to do that which it otherwise would do and then allowing them to reap the profits? This is what's called crony capitalism, right? You know, if this had been done, look at it this way. 5 individuals, 2 Washington lobbyist groups, the Bill Gates people paid for it, and the federal government put it in your schools. I ask this question all the time. Imagine this. What if instead of Bill Gates, the $6 billion was put up by the evil Koch brothers? And what if instead of 2 left-leaning Washington lobbyist groups, she had 2 right-leaning ones? And what if instead of a very liberal president, she had a very conservative one who basically bribed 44 states to take a set of standards that nobody had seen? I'm pretty sure I know what your answer is. I would despise it as much as I do now. But do you think the people who currently support Common Core, your administrators, your politicians, do you think they'd still support it if it had been done that way? If it were the Koch brothers, wouldn't it be splashed all over the front pages of every newspaper? Rogue billionaire buys public education. Wouldn't people be demanding to know what the quid pro quo is? What do these billionaires get from this? Has anybody asked that question about Bill Gates? You know, it's been estimated that at least 70% of American school districts, 70, are going to have to upgrade their technology capacity, in many instances a whole lot, to be able to accommodate the kind of testing that Common Core requires. Whose computers do you think are going in those schools? We honestly believe, again, this is what blows me away. If it were anybody else who had done this, we'd be screaming bloody murder. The left would be outraged. If it were the Koch brothers, and maybe this is the only silver lining in Common Core I've ever found, Harry Reid's head would explode all over the Senate floor, wouldn't it? Can you imagine if it were the Kochs? That Harry Reid would just go ballistic. Without doubt, the implementation of Common Core will cost hundreds of millions, and the U.S. Department of Education has already given $350 million to education companies like Pearson to develop curriculum and assessments. Why is the government paying Pearson to produce Common Core materials? So that those materials aligned exactly with what the Common Core Committee people want, so it's seamless. There is no distinction between curriculum and the standards, none, 0. And yet, and to me, of all the lies of Common Core, that's the most aggravating one. This is Josh Katz. He is a self-defined liberal progressive. He's a high school math teacher in Orange County, Florida. He's doing exactly what I'm doing, going across the country warning people about the dangers of Common Core from the left's perspective. I want you to listen briefly to what Mr. Katz has to say, because again, facts, apparently your politics matter, at least for the media, at least for academia, at least for a lot of our benighted politicians. It does seem to matter what side of the aisle you're on. It's okay. Listen to what I just said and then listen to what Mr. Katz has to say.
Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing it's stupid. There I was working with a student, Natalie, on solving equations. She had to multiply 2 times 9 and got stuck. Now, this happens all the time. I'm used to it, but I decided to go for the teaching moment. All she had to do is count by twos 9 times. Now, she tried and failed 4 different times on her fingers, on paper, in English, in Spanish. 2, 4, 8, 12. Natalie was 16 years old and in the 9th grade, and she's not alone, not by a long shot. I teach at a high school with a student population of near 3,000. It's one of 30,000 high schools across the US, so you have to imagine how many Natalies are out there. Now, I've seen the best of our school system, and I can say that our best students can compete with the best students from around the world. In fact, when looking at the PISA results that compares our students to other countries, we currently rank in the 20s. Yet, if we disaggregate our results by district poverty level and compare the US districts to those top countries by poverty rates, it is clear that our students are at the top. But our best students are only a small percentage of the overall population, even in the honors classes. And then what about the Natalies? I specialize in teaching algebra to the bottom 25% of high school students, and I work mostly with those students. Now, the best of those students want to do well, but when they realize what they're capable of, they're either stuck in a path of academic mediocrity, or they are so close to graduation they just need a credit to pass. It's almost like a scene of wasted potential. Now, the worst of those students have had no education of character, common decency, appropriate language, appropriate behavior. They barely know right from wrong. These are the students who are at risk of dropping out, incarceration, or abusing social welfare. Now, what's out there waiting for those students? Jobs? College? They're in an education system that says if you don't go to college, you have no worth. So their only alternative is to be underemployed, to find illegal work, or to abuse social welfare. Those students are marginalized by what I call a toxic culture of education. It doesn't matter if a student is a gifted artist, a loving caretaker, talented musician, or poetic writer. Those students are the fish being judged on how they climb trees because we say the end-all, be-all is college, or we're leaving students to the lowest skill level work. Even in the honors classes, these students are so wrapped up about grades and answers, they're afraid to learn, and that's impacting how they're performing at college. But I am not here to talk about the current student loan debt crisis. Now, you have to understand, I don't place the blame on them. Yes, they can take credit for who they are, but this is about something much bigger than the students. Our toxic culture of education begins with a classic supervillain archetype. I focus on Syndrome from The Incredibles. The supervillain's plan is to unleash a doom onto the world that only the supervillain can stop, thus gaining all the desired power. Now, this is exactly what happened in education in the 1980s and before, and then culminated in No Child Left Behind. Private education companies realized they could use public education, a multi-billion-dollar industry, to create a nearly endless stream of taxpayer money. They channeled millions of dollars into lobbying efforts and focused on 2 words, rigor and accountability, and put everything into place. State statutes were passed, district rules were enforced, and then finally No Child Left Behind became the national standard. Don't get me wrong about politics. These efforts were underway long before they were passed, so both parties get to take full credit for their disastrous results, especially with Race to the Top. We somehow took the education system that produced the individuals who put a man on the moon with technology less powerful than the phone in my pocket and characterized that education system as a failure, using the word accountability. We only have one way to address accountability: standardized testing. So we implemented standardized testing, and then a 1983 publication called A Nation at Risk showed standardized tests proved schools were failing, teachers were failing, students were failing, and when everything is failing, guess what we need? New textbooks, new workbooks, new resources, new training, accountability systems, new schools, private schools, charter schools, and who is it that creates all of these things that all of a sudden we need? Our supervillain, private education companies. The only way to feed a business model in this toxic culture of education is to perpetuate a picture of failure. I would love to meet any education company that has a business model that is built upon long-term student success. There simply is no money in long-term student success. Now, how is it that we can believe that a standardized test is what accurately measures student achievement? How can we believe that it measures student growth? That moment when the student's light bulb is finally lit, aha. That moment when a student says, thank you for helping him graduate with a 2.0 GPA. How can we attach a number to that moment when a third grader finally has the ability to write his own name? Who, by the way, has been labeled as a failure for himself, his teacher, and his school. Yet we crave education standardization. We believe we need these high-stakes tests because we eat up the misinformation provided by these companies and policies using a false validity of their testing results. Our testing culture begins in elementary school. Colleagues of mine work with third graders who suffer from anxiety from high-stakes testing. From a one-day, one-shot, 4-hour computer-based test, the future path of a student is set, an academic identity is established, and a message is delivered loud and clear, either you can or you can't make it. And no matter what the teacher tells the student about how good they are or what talents they have, if the student doesn't score well on that high-stakes test, the third graders know exactly what it means and begin to define themselves. And it's starting to happen now in kindergarten. So we continue this barrage of standardized tests, and the students continue failing, and the districts have to continue the next initiatives that can solve the problems. Who is it that manufactures these products? Who creates these solutions? Our supervillain. Private companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill, who operate off policy and legislation written by nonprofit organizations and lobbying groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. Buy the next textbook, buy the next workbook, buy the next digital software package, the next teacher evaluation system. I have been through 3 Algebra 1 textbooks in 7 years, and still we stick to the standardized tests. Guess who makes those? In this toxic culture, we illogically attempt to compare education to business. We completely ignore the impact of poverty and hunger on student achievement, and we pay no attention to the non-cognitive factors like personal habits and personal values that are the realistic measures and predictors of student achievement. In that way, we can place the blame on the schools and on the teachers to continue the cycle. And because we have a toxic culture of education, the teachers and the schools have accepted this accountability for all students, even those students. We take the blame for a student who can't focus in class because she hasn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. We take the blame for a student who's always in trouble in school because he doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. We take the blame for a student who can't stay awake in class because she spends her nights on a different couch, depending on which friend takes her in. And when these students don't score well, it's about to get worse. The Common Core will do even more damage because of its emphasis on high-stakes testing matched with its myopic standards that are disguised in critical thinking. I've seen my daughter's kindergarten and first grade assignments. This isn't critical thinking. This is developmentally inappropriate rote. You think they can fool me with this stuff? Any education reform that doesn't address high-stakes testing and the non-cognitive factors of true success like character and integrity is a complete waste of time, and it's killing our kids.
Yeah, and it's killing our kids. Let me start by making a quick observation about this. To my mind, take this as my opinion. For the first time today, I want to give you my opinion that's not backed up by fact. This, to me, represents the limits of progressive thought. Do you notice who the supervillain is? The ultimate villain, the arch villain? It's always the private company. You just heard me blast Pearson. I have no use for this kind of, this is a perversion of capitalism, this crony nonsense. But having said that, who's got the real power here? The private education companies or the federal government who puts it in your schools? You just saw the slide. Your federal government is paying Pearson to monopolize.
They're indistinguishable.
Right. Well, they're not indistinguishable. They're indistinguishable in the sense that they're working together, but the one group has the power. The feds could stop Pearson tomorrow from doing this. Pearson is at the whim of the federal government on this. If Pearson says stop, or we're going to drag you into civil court for monopolistic behavior, Pearson stops. My only point about this is that the limits of the progressive thinking. You've got to understand the federal government's role in this. Having said that, I think he's right about everything else. Who decided that American schools were failing? If you look at the arc of American achievement in schools from 1900 to 1975, it's a steady upward rise. That our schools were great. Our schools, for most of the 20th century, were the envy of the civilized world. Who decided they were failing? And when did we decide it? Teachers didn't wake up in 1975 and say, hey, our kids are bad. Our students weren't unhappy. Moms and dads didn't think their kids were being miseducated. University professors, we didn't decide in 1976 that kids were showing up on college campuses unprepared. What happened in the late 1970s? Well, we created the Department of Education at the federal level. For 200 years, we educated kids very well without it. And no sooner did we create it than the feds had to justify all those billions that were going to the Department of Ed that used to go directly to the states to help kids learn. So what did the Federal Department of Education do? They hired companies like Pearson and McGraw-Hill to start administrating big standardized tests. And guess what those tests written by those companies proved? Everything was failing. As Mr. Katz said, right? There's no money. If you're Pearson Publishing, there's no money in educational success. Look, we've been doing math take kids from kindergarten to high school, 5-year-olds to 17-year-olds. Nothing has changed in math for those age groups in 2,000 years. Have we invented a number that I'm unaware of? Did we add a couple new shapes to geometry class? Have we changed the theorems around? It's the same stuff. And if that's the case, you ought to be able to buy one math textbook for your schools and use it for 50 years. But there's no money in that. Do you remember, isn't it interesting? Remember, you're old enough to remember. You guys remember new math? With all due respect, what does that mean? What's new about it? Nothing has changed. It was a disaster, a failure. But all you're paying for in these new textbooks is all of this sociological junk they're filling the textbooks with. Right? All of this political correctness and this multiculturalism and all of this social justice nonsense that has nothing to do with numbers. Amen. Social engineering is what your kids' math texts are being used for. Right? And so, as Mr. Katz points out, and I wanted you to hear it because he makes a brilliant point, we managed to educate an entire generation of people who put a man on the moon with less technology than the cell phone you're pointing at me right now. Right? And we characterized that education system as a failure. Well, who did it? It was the private education companies that did it. And do you notice how, ever since the late 1970s, every 4 or 5 years on the button head, we throw out everything we were doing and we start over. So you have to, remember No Child Left Behind? How many billions? And let's be bipartisan here. Who's the individual who gave us No Child Left Behind? That would be George W. Bush. But what most people don't know is Bush didn't write No Child Left Behind. Who did Bush allow to write it? Ted Kennedy. So, Bush is supposed to be this uber right-wing conservative, right? That's how he's painted in the media. But he turned the writing of the entire No Child Education program over to Teddy Kennedy and his people. And after Kennedy had written it, Bush had the Kennedys over to the White House for movie and popcorn night to celebrate. It was an absolute disaster, No Child Left Behind. I have never yet met a principal, a superintendent, a teacher who has anything but contempt for No Child Left Behind. What did they hate about No Child Left Behind, all the educators? One-size-fits-all education, meaningless emphasis on standardized tests, cookie-cutter education, right? And yet, what is Common Core but No Child Left Behind on steroids? It's all the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind, elevated to a more intensely, specifically federal level. That's what you got with Common Core. Katz is exactly right. Who's responsible for this? So I'm going to give you one of my definitions of Common Core here. You can see and please notice who 95% of this information came from. Common Core is an unholy alliance between an obviously out-of-control federal government that's exceeding its statutory boundaries and a small group of crony capitalist companies that stand to rake in billions of dollars working with the feds. Pearson Publishing right now, Pearson owns 100% of the Canadian textbook market, all of it. You cannot buy a textbook in Canada that's not Pearson's. Right now, Pearson owns 80% of the American textbook market, 80%. Do you know your federal government gave Pearson the exclusive contract to produce, mass distribute, and score the exams? Do you know that Pearson Publishing makes $30 off of every single test your kid takes? It's between $30 and $60. 30 is the lower end of that. What's 30 times 60 million? It's a lot of money, isn't it? And why did the federal government not open this up to a bid like they're supposed to do? If you don't think it would have been cheaper if we allowed all those different private companies to bid on these materials? We didn't open that up to them. You just saw, the liberal Mazenko points out, we didn't just give Pearson the contract, we're paying Pearson hundreds of millions of dollars to do this for the federal government. What does the federal government get out of all of this Common Core? They get a lot of control, as you're going to see. What do the companies get? They get rich. And why are we debating Common Core? Just listen to the people who put it in your schools. They tell you what they're doing. This is a direct quote from Bill Gates from 2009. You keep hearing about how you got state and local control in Georgia, that the worst aspects of this you'll be able to keep out. Would you listen to what Gates said in 2009? When the tests are aligned to the Common Core standards, the curriculum will line up as well. Do you understand what he just told you? That you're getting your tests this year, Georgia, and when the tests align to the Common Core, we control the curriculum. The curriculum lines up with what we tell you to do. By the way, I don't know off the top of my head, I should have looked this up. Smarter Balance or Park, which do you have in Georgia? Neither. Who's testing you guys? McGraw-Hill, you're going to be getting Park then. And guess what? That's even better. 2 months ago, in the newspapers, you can find it online, the CEO of Park Testing came out and said, it's true, quote, the purpose of the tests is not to teach us what we need to know about educating your kids. The purpose of the tests is to drive curriculum. The purpose of the tests is to take over the control of what gets taught in your classrooms. That's the CEO of the company that's going to start testing your kids. Think about that for a second. What blows me away by the obtuseness of your not all of them, but a good number of your legislators, the obtuseness of your educational officials who are behind this, is they either pretend they don't know this or they don't know it. And I don't know which is worse. The people who put this in are doing this, tell you exactly what they're doing. I don't see how you can get people stand up there and lie to you and tell you this is state-led, Common Core is state-led. There is not a shred of evidence to prove that. None. How many of you heard this lie, that Common Core math has been internationally benchmarked? You heard that? There's not a single shred. In 5 years' time, nobody has seen any evidence. We've all been begging for it. You know what the National Common Core people did 2 weeks ago? They just slowly, kind of quietly pulled the claim that they're benchmarked. They sort of pulled it off the website. No explanation, nothing. They've taken that down now. After 5 years of convincing you they've done it. This is a pretty serious statement on the part of, and again, David Coleman, never been a classroom teacher. You know Arnie Duncan, your Secretary of Education? He's never been a classroom teacher. You know what Arnie Duncan's background is? He's a sociologist. Doesn't it make sense, though? Why would you? This is social engineering. Why would you put a sociologist in charge of American public schools? Because this is not about education, it's about sociology. Psychosociology, absolutely. This is about changing the perception of kids with regards to their families, their country, and their relationship to the state. That's what this is. He's telling you, oh, you know Bill Gates obviously has no educational background. Isn't he the guy that dropped out of college because it didn't work for him? What qualifies any of these people to be doing this? And you know the thing that gets me? In the last 40 years, since the Department of Education, we've had 50 different academic studies done on the relationship of state and federal standards to education. 50 different studies done in 40 years. Do you know what each one of those studies shows? Absolutely no correlation between a state standard and how your kids perform in the classroom. No correlation whatsoever between a federal national standard and how your kids perform in the classroom. You know, the only standard that's ever worked educationally, the only standard that can work, is if you have a committed parent, a disciplined child, and an effective teacher. That's it. We managed to educate kids really well in this country. Most of that time was spent with all those kids in one-room schoolhouses. There weren't any stupid school districts. There weren't any ridiculous state exams. There were no national regulations. We did really well. Why? Because moms and dads were committed to their kids' education. They busted some skulls, didn't they, if kids weren't doing their homework. We had disciplined kids who knew that schoolwork came before any other thing they had to do, including going out to milk the cows, and certainly more important than football practice. And then you got effective teachers who have the freedom and the creativity to figure out what the kid sitting in front of her needs and to be able to give it to them. Do you understand that with Common Core, we are now as far removed from that functional triad as you can get? The state standards were bad, absolutely meaningless. These federal ones now with No Child Left Behind and Common Core, you are as far removed from what actually works in the classroom unless the United Nations were to take over education. And don't think that's not a possibility. Online, you can find Bill Gates. In 2004, Bill Gates, a private citizen, signed a mutual agreement pact with the United Nations and UNESCO to seek to put this kind of education in American schools and world schools. It's not that hard to see. It's not tinfoil hat stuff. You can read the contract he signed with the United Nations online. 2004, he signed it, right?
Could you speak to the vision and mission that they have in mind?
Sure.
Because before you can do a plan, before you can do a strategic plan or implement it
Sure.
or roll it out, you have to have a vision or mission statement like you would for a company.
So what you're asking me is, what's the end game?
Citizen are they envisioning?
What's the end game? All right, usually I wait until I make my case to make this point, because the ball's rolling downhill now. But I'll jump to the chase here. The bottom line, the end game of all of this. If you give me only one word, you allow me but one word to describe Common Core, to define it, the word I would pick is statism. It is subordinating children to the state, getting kids to realize that they don't belong to their families, number one. They certainly don't belong to their local religious communities. They don't belong to their states. They are citizens of the federal government. To the federal government, they owe allegiance to the federal government is responsible for whatever good happens to them, and the federal government has the power to take that away from them. This is, and why at the global level, right? The breakdown of national sovereignty, the emphasis on one world ways of seeing things, the collectivist nature of government. Why do I use words like statism instead of socialism? Because socialism, like fascism, like Nazism, like tyranny, it's all ultimately the subordination of individual freedoms to the collective that is the state. That's what this is. Now, you may not be convinced of that yet because I haven't gotten through the presentation yet. We're just about to finish up the who did it and why the who did it part of this. Wait, give me half as much more time, and you'll see, I think, why we make these claims. 50 different academic surveys done in 40 years showing no correlation between standards at the state level and the federal level and how your kids learn. These tests don't tell us anything that can help your teachers. Nothing that can make your classrooms better. And that's why they haven't worked in 40 years. That's what's so maddening about this. We've done standardization now for 45 years. It has never worked. Before Common Core, you had No Child. Before No Child, you had Goals 2000. Before Goals 2000, go all the way back to the mid-70s when this junk started. It has never worked. It's interesting. When did American schools really start to fail? Not until the Department of Education came into being. That's when it started to go downhill. Because the entire emphasis, right away, the emphasis went from the districts to the states in the 80s. And in the 90s, it began to go from the states to the feds. No Child Left Behind, and then Common Core fully federalizes all of this. That's what happens. This is just the most recent of those academic studies. It's also the most comprehensive. This is the Brown Center Report on American Education. It was published about 4 months ago. You could go online and read all the data if you want. You can read all their data, man. This is the biggest, broadest one ever done. I'm only going to read to you the 2 concluding paragraphs. By the way, the Brown Center Report every year is published by the Brookings Institute, which is a left-leaning think tank. All right? Here's what the final 2 paragraphs say. What effect will Common Core have on national achievement? The analysis presented here suggests very little impact. The quality of the Common Core is currently being hotly debated, but the quality of past curriculum standards is unrelated to student achievement. The rigor of your state and federal standards, because have we not reached the point where rigor, R-I-G-O-R, is the only thing that you hear again and again? These standards are rigorous, right? What does it mean? The rigor of performance standards, how high the bar is set, is also unrelated to student achievement. Here's the last paragraph. Do not expect much from Common Core. Education leaders talk about standards as if they are some system of weights and measures. You understand this? There's no way you can make one standard that's going to measure 60 million kids. Do you understand that? I mean, how are you going to create one standard that takes into account poverty, that takes into account marital breakdown, that takes into account socioeconomic background, that takes into account rural schools versus inner city schools? How in the world can you possibly craft one standard that you can't do it? Education leaders, your folks, they often talk about standards as if they are some empirical set of weights and measures. The word benchmarks is thrown around promiscuously as a synonym for standards, but the term is misleading by inferring that there is some real known standard of measurement out there. There isn't any, not for that many kids with that many diverse backgrounds. And now you got American schools being filled with kids who don't even speak English, and the schools are going to have to adopt now to try to, how do you teach kids who just this year show up in your schools by the dozens, if not hundreds, who don't even speak English, who are going to have to be part of these assessments too? How do you accommodate that in one standard? You can't. I love what he says here. Standards in education are best understood as aspirational. You know these standards we're spending all the money on at the state and federal level? They're about as effective as your New Year's Eve resolutions. You know how you go to bed on New Year's Eve? Thank you. You know how you go to bed on New Year's Eve? And you make that resolution with a couple glasses of champagne that you're going to get up every morning at 5 a.m. and go jogging. That's a standard. It has about as much merit as these standards do. Yet, doesn't it depend on you? You got to drag your sorry butt out of bed. You got to put the shoes on, right? The weather has to cooperate, because if it's really cold, you're not going to go jogging. So listen to what they tell you. Standards in education are best understood as aspirational. And like a strict diet or a prudent plan to save money, they represent good intentions that are often not fulfilled. The only thing that I don't care what standard you have at the federal or the state level, the only way the standard works is if you have a committed parent, a parent who makes their kids do their work, a disciplined child who can put down the stupid cell phone and do the work, and an effective teacher who can help that kid learn. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think I need to tell you this, but 2/3 of what makes education work has nothing to do with the schools anyway. It's moms and dads and kids. Do you understand that Common Core is the antithesis of this? Do you honestly believe that these regulatory brains not even regulatory brains, you think the brain of Bill Gates knows better what your kids need in your classrooms, what your daughter needs from her teacher that day, than these one-size-fits-all boilerplate standards do? It doesn't make any sense. It's never worked. We've got 45 years of failure with this kind of system. But isn't that typical of big government? When big government takes over something and it fails, do they ever turn it back to the states? No. What do? They make it bigger, more regulated, more expensive, more federal, and ultimately more meaningless. There's your Brown Center report. Let's talk about these standards quickly as we coast to the downside. Let's talk about them. You need one last little history lesson, and then I'll stop giving you history lessons. The Common Core people did something else that is pretty shameless. You've seen all the ways that Common Core has not been transparent. How about the fact that Common Core is branding so badly? In Alabama alone, 70% of moms and dads hate it. In most states, it's in the 60s. All right. So what is Common Core going to do about the fact that moms and dads hate it? Well, they're just changing the name of all the new standards. The new science standards that are being filtered into your schools, they don't call them Common Core anymore. They're calling them the next generation science standards. Because you don't like the word Common Core, they're not going to fix the standards. They're just going to rename them. How about this little piece of information? Back in 2011, after the standards were finally written, the Common Core Committee paid an outside group of people to come to Washington and validate the standards. This committee of 29 people that the Common Core people hired, called the Validation Committee, they were given absolute carte blanche to throw the standards out, to get rid of them, to rewrite them, to revise them, whatever they wanted to do. Interestingly, on this committee of 29, They only brought one math specialist and one English specialist. That was it. A lot of activists, a lot of people with very minimal education background. One math professor and one English professor. The math professor is a retired Stanford University math professor, a man by the name of Professor James Milgram. Now, Milgram's a serious guy. Most of the math calculations used to get us to the moon in 1969 were done by Jim Milgram. He's a very serious man. He was the only math expert. And he said, he voted no. He said the standards should be thrown out immediately. He said, and I quote, "It is an absolute joke to think that Common Core math is going to prepare your kids for STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and math, or even math at a college level." The English professor, another retired professor by the name of Dr. Sandra Stotsky, she's been to your states multiple times now. She is considered the foremost expert on English developmental standards. She also voted no. She said, throw the standards out immediately. And she said, quote, "These standards in reading and writing and comprehension will set our kids 2 years behind the 2 years they're already behind the rest of the world." Not only did the two experts vote no, they convinced other people on the committee to vote no. Do you know what the Common Core people did? They just erased their name from all the documents. They just cut and pasted them out of every single document. And they validated the standards with the people who remained. That's a fact. 2 clicks of a mouse, that's a fact. That's why Stotsky and Milgram are traveling the country doing what I'm doing. And they were in the room. They were in the room when those standards were being written. And they rejected them. This comes directly from Sandy. And as an English professor, this makes perfect sense to me. Let me give you, before we begin this section, let me give you an analogy. You want to know what Common Core is? You got to think of Common Core as a 3-legged stool. 3 equally important legs. Because with any 3-legged stool, if you pull one leg out, the whole thing collapses. You have to see them in unison. What are the 3 legs of the stool? The federal government, the Common Core people, and the textbook companies who are being paid to produce all the material for your teachers to teach based on those standards. That's the 3-legged stool. Having said that, why won't Common Core English work? Well, for starters, Common Core requires 50% less reading at every single grade level and 50% more writing. Kids are writing more than they're reading in Common Core. And as Sandy points out, if your kids are writing but not reading, what are they writing about? Maybe that's where that assignment that went viral in Wisconsin a year and a half ago, maybe where assignments like that one came from. Little 3rd graders were sent home and told to write an essay on how the state is just like the family, but better. Do you understand why I use the word statism now? Why explain to us, little 9-year-olds, how the state is just like the family, but better. This is the sociological impact of that. Also, in Common Core English, Common Core English mandates that 50% of the literature your kids used to read in English class, the stories, are removed in favor of so-called informational texts, many of which come directly from the federal government. So your kids are not reading literature anymore, in a greatly reduced way. Instead, they're getting, for lack of a better word, government propaganda. Why do we read kids' stories in English class? When you put your kids to bed at night, you want to get them to go to sleep, right? So why wouldn't you read them a Bill Gates computer manual? I mean, that would work, right? But you don't. You read them stories because you know that stories is how kids love to read and learn to read. And when you're reading the great classics of literature, right, from the great writers, you're reading, I don't know, Ralph Ellison or Mark Twain or Shakespeare, you don't know how those people would have voted on immigration. You don't know what their environmental attitudes would have been. When you read the great classics, you're discussing character, morality, big issues like war and peace and love and truth, justice. That's all being pulled out, that literature, and being replaced with one-sided political information in English class. As Sandy points out, much more indoctrination within text, much less discussion of what we used to discuss. Here are some of those informational texts your kids are going to be exposed to. By the time your daughter's in 9th grade, a freshman in high school, she'll be reading things like recommended levels of insulation, a report released in 2010 by the US EPA and the Department of Energy. It's a 50-page regulatory manual that simply lays out the proper way to environmentally correctly insulate a new building. Is that the kind of book that's going to get your kid to want to read? How about by the time your son's in 10th grade? He's going to be reading President Obama's own executive orders, handed directly from the White House. Executive Order 13423, strengthening federal environmental, energy, and transportation management. Sandy estimates that about 35% of these exemplar texts deal exclusively with man-made global warming. There is no counter view. Remember what Mr. Katz said? This is developmentally inappropriate rote. This isn't critical thinking. You remember what the Chicago Teachers Union said? This is not critical thinking, it's developmentally inappropriate. Critical thinking means you supply kids with a variety of opinions and you let them make up their own minds. This is the federal government handing over a specific set of documents and a specific set of perspectives that it wants your kids to learn. How about the long essay on the evolution of the grocery bag? Spoiler alert, paper and plastic are both bad, and America's destroying the planet. And as Sandy Stotsky points out, as if that weren't bad enough, the removal of all the politically neutral stuff in favor of government propaganda, you've also got this question: why? Of what little literature remains in Common Core. Why is so much of it sexualized? Why is so much of it borderline pornography? Here's one example. This is Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Now, again, Morrison is a fantastic writer. She's won a Nobel Prize in Literature. She's one of our great writers in American tradition. But we would not assign this book to freshmen in college. It's about a 12-year-old girl who's a victim of rape and incest. And over the course of the book, she comes to bond with her rapist and writes in very graphic ways about their encounters. I blocked out the bad words, but if you can read that, this book has been pulled out of Common Core classrooms for kids as young as middle school, eighth grade. This book has been pulled out of Common Core Catholic classrooms for kids as young as middle school. There are dozens of books like it, books like Dreaming in Cuban and Black Swan, that have shockingly graphic sexuality in them. Skipping ahead, Sandy Stotsky says, there's Sandy. Why did she vote no? We need to explore why so many of these exemplar texts are out of place, not just in the subject area Common Core put them, but in a high school curriculum altogether. And it's not just the high school kids' books that are highly sexualized. How about this assignment, Common Core assignment, for an 8-year-old, a 3rd grader? This 8-year-old, this class was sent home with a paragraph. And it's a pretty good English assignment. Send kids home with a paragraph and have them identify the main character, identify what the paragraph's about. I mean, it was a good assignment until Common Core got it. Listen to this paragraph for an 8-year-old. Ruby sat on the bed she shared with her husband, holding a hair clip. There was something mysterious and powerful about the cheaply manufactured neon clip that she was fondling in her newly suspicious hands. She didn't recognize the hair clip. It was too big to be their daughter's, and Ruby was sure it wasn't hers. She hadn't had friends over in weeks, but here was this hair clip, little and green, with a few long strands of black hair caught in it. Ruby ran her fingers through her own blonde hair. She had just been vacuuming when she noticed the small, bright green object under the bed. Now their life would never be the same. She would wait here until her husband Mike returned home. In other words, an 8-year-old has to conclude from reading that Dad is having an adulterous affair in his mom's bed. There are all sorts of these assignments out there for kids. As Sandy says, what is it doing here? And that's the sociology. Breaking down, and not just breaking down personal barriers, unraveling Judeo-Christian morality. All of it. This is the death of chastity, the death of modesty. So Marxists for about 150 years have identified the death of bonding. All of it. Marxists for about 150 years have identified Christianity as the single biggest impediment to state takeovers. Breaking down chastity, breaking down traditional moral values, that is one of the ways. It's what the Soviets did. They used to break kids down. The kids, the proletarian kids that they brought in, they break them down by divorcing them from their families and all that 1,000-year history of Orthodox Christianity by highly sexualizing their lesson plans.
So the previous slide was obedience to doctrine,
yep,
as if it was military conscription.
Right.
Where instead of the schools being places where you become a scholar or an academic, you're there to be a member of an army.
Yeah, and as you're about to see as we look at the math standards next, the purpose, you said it exactly right. The purpose of this is not to make your kids better readers. The purpose of math is not to create mathematicians and engineers. The purpose of math is a institutional and sociological purpose. Here's what I'm talking about. Professor Milgram showed up at the committee, and he said, okay, you guys talk about having internationally benchmarked the math standards. What countries did you measure it with? And they handed him a list. Sweden and Finland and South Korea, all the countries that do math education well. Milgram said, great, now show me your math. And for the entire time they sat on that committee, they didn't produce any evidence. And at 5 years into Common Core, they've not produced a single shred of evidence. Sandy said, we're convinced that they just wrote down a list of countries on a piece of paper. There's no evidence it's ever been done. That's one of the reasons Milgram voted no. And in talking to Professor Milgram, we brought both Milgram and Stotsky to testify before our state legislature in Wisconsin. So at the website I put up at the end, you can watch their testimony free of charge, and a bunch of other people's testimony, just get a sense of what they were saying. But the argument became, there is no real math reason for doing Common Core. Common Core math is not simpler, it is not more direct, it is not more thorough, it's never been tested. Your kids are guinea pigs. So the topic came around to what was called social justice math. It's not fair that most kids can't do math at a high level. That's just a fact. Remember your own math classes? Out of 30 students, how many can really do math at a high level? 10, 12, 8? And because most kids can't be really good at math, it's not fair that some kids can. So we need a math paradigm that allows everybody to be comfortable with a little math, but nobody to excel. And I'm going to prove that to you. This young woman is a community organizer from the state of Chicago, and she's talking to a group of high school math teachers, about the fundamental premise of Common Core math.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the why.
There you go, right? This is what's called process math. Look, I would have been a great math student if I didn't have to get the right answer. I bet you would have too. If you could have gotten your engineering degree and not been accurate, wouldn't that have been nice? Look, and haven't we always given I couldn't have passed math if I didn't get credit for getting the wrong, you know, when you go through a math problem and you get the wrong answer, you're going to get a 0 and fail math unless the teacher gives you a bone by, okay, you tried to do it. All right, so I was always a C- math student. I got through it, but I didn't learn much. But now that's what the emphasis is here. And as Milgram points out, in every high-achieving math country on earth, all of them, kids start algebra, serious algebra, in 7th grade or even 6th. In No Child Left Behind America, our kids didn't even start algebra until 8th grade. And under Common Core, algebra's pushed into high school. And if you're not starting algebra to high school, your kids will not get calculus and advanced math in high school anymore. High school districts all across the country, including right next door in Florida, are beginning to pull calculus as an offering out of high school because they will not prepare your kids to take it. They're not going to offer it anymore. That's a big deal. Then there's this, right? So many examples. If you type in sexualized Common Core examples, you'll get 1,000. You type in goofy Common Core math, you'll get 10,000 hits. The way Common Core math is done, as Milgram talks about. The young girl in the video is in 3rd grade. Her mother is a college math professor and cannot help the 3rd grader with her math homework. We've created a math program that moms and dads are unable to help their kids with. That's the state as part of the statism aspect of this. Dividing them, right? Only the state schools now have the key to figure this garbage out. And even if your kids can do math the old-fashioned way and get the right answer every time, they don't get credit for it. They have to do it. You got a kid who can do traditional math. You got a 7th grader who's ready for calculus. But if that 7th grader can't do the Common Core way, they get no credit for doing it at all. Watch this little video. Here's the difficult math problem the little girl's going to do. Add those 3 numbers, 1568, 1423, and 680.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000. So I'm going to do that.
So a square is 100, a cube is 1,000. And by the way, in every different math class, they do it differently. It's not always a cube is 1,000, not always a square is 100.
That's 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets.
So you notice how nobody's adding anything, right? This is just what you have to do to get the first number on the board.
We have 60, which are just lines of 10.
The lines are 10s, the dots are 1s. Now you got to put the second number on the board.
For her birthday, she got 1,000. 23. The dots represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, or let's just say 3,000 because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100, 200, 300, 400. So now we can erase all these sheets and hundreds and tens and singles. So we could just add, and that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. Now that problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's what we're doing in school. But at home, I'm taught how to stack, and we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's why we have to figure it out that way.
Okay.
So I'm going to stack these numbers, which is way easy.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problems.
I got 2 different answers.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Maybe I counted wrong.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something messed up on this sheet.
What do you think happened?
Well, since that way was more confusing and it was like things were like all over the place, like it was hard to add them together because we had a lot of sheets and a lot of strips all on the board.
Yeah.
It was kind of harder to add them together. You need to be more organized.
More organized.
And this way is way more organized. I could just look at this information and wasn't as confused.
All right, you get the gist, right? And as Milgram points out, there is no, look, I don't want to be glib. As a bad math student myself, I get that some kids learn differently. I get that there might be some kids who can benefit from a visualization technique, but why do you prohibit the doing of it the logical way? Right. As Milgram says, let the kids do it the most obvious way, the way that benefits kids who know math. And then for kids who need extra help, if on their own time you want to give them that, give it to them. Yeah. But you prohibit kids. You will not credit kids who do it that way. And if you're a kid who can do math, I wasn't, but if you're a kid who can do math, do you understand what that's going to do? Forcing them to do that way? Look, and this is, I keep asking you this question. Why are we debating this? It's been decided. The people who wrote it told you what it is. This is Jason Zimba. He is the architect of Common Core math. He's the guy who wrote the standards, almost all of them. He had some help, but he's the lead guy. Here, Jason Zimba is being interviewed by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. You won't see her. Here, in this video clip, Zimba tells you that the standards were not intended to make your kids ready for STEM careers or even for college-level math, all right? Here's the guy who wrote the standards. It's a 30-second clip. I may stop it and start it once or twice, but you listen to the guy who did this.
Agreement that I believe we have on this.
Thank you. Thank you.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
All right, Sandy says to him, this is not a college-ready curriculum. It's a minimal definition of math. Listen to what he admits just to start this off.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges.
All right, think about what he just told you. I'll go back and play. I won't interrupt it again. She says it's not for math and selective colleges. It's not for STEM. He corrects her. It's even worse than you say it is. And by selective college, what he means is any college that has a basic math entrance requirement. All of them do. He's going to give you the example of Berkeley, right? But all universities have basic math requirements. I won't interrupt it again, but just listen to this.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley,
But we have to think of our
right?
engineering colleges
And that's
scientific
That's true.
education.
I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that, but your issue is really broader than that.
Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
Okay, thank you. That's fair.
And all he can do is shake his head yes. You can't call this college ready when it applies to a very low level of math that's not going to prepare you for engineering, business, none of those things. And all I can do is nod his head yes. This is the guy who wrote the standards. Yeah. How in the world can they get off looking at you and telling you that this math is rigorous? How in the world can they get off telling you that this is internationally benchmarked? How can they tell you this math is going to prepare your kids for college and career ready? It's all a big lie. And don't listen to me. But you understand what you got here today? Who's told you all of this? Who's told you this? You got Gates. You got the two lawyers in charge of the Department of Education. You got Zimba, who wrote the math standards. You got the two people who were hired to evaluate the committee, and they rejected it. Who's telling you all this stuff? How about this? Here's another math. Here's a second grader's math problem. You understand? Tell me how this works. Here's a second grade math problem. The question is this. Tell how to make 10 when adding 8 plus 5. Now, give the little boy a cookie, because that would have been my answer. You cannot make 10 with 8.5, 8 plus 5. The kid gets it marked wrong, and here's what the teacher writes. Yes, you can. Take 2 from 5 and add it to 8. 8 plus 2 equals 10. Then add 3. I'm glad you're confused because I don't know anything about math. I'm glad you're confused.
Yeah, no one owns reality except Common Core.
You know, if you stop and think about that, you could make it work. But it doesn't tell you anything about math. If you take the number 5 and subtract and take 2 from it, and then add that 2 to 8, you get 10. And then if you add 3 more, you get 13. I get that. But couldn't you say, take 100? You want to get to 8 plus 5. You want to get to 10. Well, take 100 add 3,000 and subtracts 2,902. You'll get to it. I mean, you can do that, but what does that have to do with, that's not math. That's just torturing little kids. And again, the kids who suffer the most from this are those kids who could really excel in math, right? And oh, how about this? They're already doing it to the science standards as well. The science standards are being sexualized as well. Listen to this very short clip from Michigan.
Now to the homework assignment that really left a local family completely stunned. It's something that you'd expect to see in an episode of Maury Povich or something, but certainly not in a classroom. Our Mara McDonald is in Romeo with more on what's being called baby daddy biology.
Carmen, here it is. It's part of a 3-page bio homework on DNA, and it's question number 8. And it's a doozy.
So do you understand why this is inappropriate, Audrey?
Audrey Basie just wanted to get her bio homework on DNA done when she got to a question that stumped her. It reads, the sister of the mom above also had issues with finding out who the father of her baby was. She had the state take a blood test of potential fathers. Based on the information in this table, why was the baby taken away by the state after the test? As if that question isn't tacky enough, look at the potential fathers: bartender, guy at the club, cab driver, or flight attendant. Father Larry Basie took one look at this piece of homework and flipped.
What are they teaching? What is this? I couldn't come up with the words. I'm like, oh my God. It's teaching them that it's okay to not know who it is because you can have the state help you. And if they can't help you, they're going to take your child away. And it's not the way it is.
Were you fired up?
Oh, I was beyond fired up last night.
The Basies called the school district and then had a long talk with Audrey. Doesn't there have to be a better way of teaching teenagers about DNA?
Now that I see what it really means, I think it depicts women in a really uncomfortable light.
So the Basies called the district, and so did we. And the official word from Romeo High School is, you know what? This question isn't well executed or conceived, so there's not going to be any more baby daddy biology. It will be changed in the future. Back to you.
Well, the thing that nobody points out, first of all, why in the world do you need to do this? This is a simple biology question, right? It's like we used to do with our little genetics things, right? Where you try to figure out ratios. Easy. Why are you sexualizing it? And the thing that gets me that nobody pointed out, the bottom line question that was asked was not a biology question. Did you catch that? The bottom line, after you do your math calculations, tell us why the state took the child away from the mother. That's a sociology question, isn't it? Do you see what I mean? That all these disciplines are English, math, science, they're being completely subordinated to the larger sociological imperatives, things that you moms and dads are the ones that are supposed to do. Teach your kids what your sexuality values are, your religious values. The state's now interposing themselves between you and your children to become surrogate parents whose job it is to give them the information. They don't trust you to do it anymore. Just like they don't trust your teachers to teach. You know, Arnie Duncan has made a big spiel about this. He wants to rename teachers facilitators. And a lot of the new Common Core textbooks, if you look at them, they don't refer to teachers as teachers. What's the difference between a teacher and a facilitator? A teacher is somebody who has wisdom and knowledge to impart, something they can give. A facilitator is merely somebody who receives something from somebody and hands it to somebody else. All this is being scripted now at the national level. All these textbook companies are scripting it the way the national people want it. Your teachers are becoming meaningless. That's why your unions are beginning to balk at this. But it's already happening, right? And then here's the actual biology assignment, and I love it. Mom wrote on the assignment, my family does not feel these questions are appropriate. Please dismiss these questions from my children's grade. We teach our kids not to sleep around, right? Again, why would you have to write this on a biology lesson? And this may be the most shocking thing I've shown you yet. This is one of 27 different American school districts who are threatening and warning moms and dads not to let their kids do any math other than the math they're supposed to do in the grade that they're in. What happened, and this is from the entire school district of Irvine Unified School District, Orange County, California. What happened in California is that moms and dads were freaking out because by the time their kids were in 4th and 5th grade, they could not add basic numbers or multiply them in their heads. They couldn't do it. You know, because one of the things you are not allowed to do, teach kids anymore, is to multiplication tables. There is no memorization. They don't do any of those drills for little kids. It's considered passé. You're not allowed to have kids memorize basic multiplication tables. So not surprisingly, moms freaked out because in middle school, their kids couldn't do it. So moms started hiring tutors, having their kids work ahead. School district freaked out. Here is what the website said. Here's the warning. The links on this page are intended to support the classroom instruction that your child receives from the teacher. It is not appropriate to go ahead of the classroom or to use this site to have your child work on math intended for subsequent grade levels. That's the warning. Now here's the threat. Your child's math instruction and math placement will not change as a result of working ahead. This means that your child will continue to work in the grade level appropriate math, regardless of any work that is done and turned into the teacher. So your 5th grader may be ready for geometry, your 7th grader might be ready for calculus, but your kid's going to stay with his peers and do the same lines and cubes and circles until he gets to the next level. Nobody moves ahead. Do you understand why we call this socialist? It doesn't matter what your kids' gifts or talents are, they all stay chained to their peers because that's social justice, right? Social justice used to mean something about trying to redress inequities. This isn't that. This is fanaticism that insists that every kid is the same kid. That's the only way we have equality. Their individual gifts and talents, their God-given abilities have to be stamped into one mold, one shape, right? It's the old Soviet maxim, right? That which blade of grass do you cut first? Well, the one that sticks its head above the others. That's the one you lop off, right? This is programmatic. What this is destroying all children. Because let's do the math real quick that our schools won't do. If you want to get more kids to exactly the same place, do you ultimately have to lower a standard or raise it? You gotta lower it. Every iteration of standards we've had before Common Core have done exactly that. However rigorous they were, or however high the standards were when you started them, they always lowered them because every time you raise a standard, more kids drop off. Again, you want an equal society, you want perfect equality, like in the name of this, you want this kind of social justice, then I demand to play in the NBA. There's nobody who looks like me in the NBA. But then again, if you want to get me, and I'm not picky, I'll be the 13th man. I'll wear a jumpsuit and wave a towel. I don't have to play. I'd be thrilled to collect the $4 million base salary. But you're going to get me in the NBA. Are you going to ultimately have to raise the level of play at the NBA or lower it? Yeah, a whole lot. That's what they're doing to your kids, right? This may be the most shocking thing. You got American school districts threatening parents not to help your kids do more than they should at a grade level. A school's doing this now. And there are 27 different districts in 27 different states that have threatened moms and dads this way. You know, we've lost more gifted and talented education programs in the last 2 years and in the previous 40 combined because there's no place for excellence anymore. You're not going to be able to do it. There will honors college classes or just honors classes have been labeled racist, bigoted, homophobic, right? Anything that valedictorians are being removed from schools all across the country because it's not fair that only one person gets the highest grade. One school district in California made the entire, one school in California made the entire 420 graduating seniors valedictorians. From the ones, even the ones who failed and didn't get their diplomas, they got to be listed as valedictorians too, because that's socially equal, you see. That's not justice. It's not equality. For lack of a better word, it's socialism and social engineering. But they're doing this to your kids now, right? Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap it up a little bit quickly. I'm going to spare a couple of little things, simply because it's at 3 o'clock now, and we've got a 3-hour ride ahead of us. So we're going to give you, probably end up giving you about 75% of what I could. So what I'm going to skip over is some of the data mining stuff, if that's okay. I'll say a couple quick words about data mining, just so you get your mind around it. This is the facility the feds built in the Utah desert. This is where they're going to house all the data they collect on your kids. When you and I went to school, the only thing that ever appeared on our transcripts was our final grades. You know now, right, that under Common Core, every single grade, every single teacher comment, every single quiz, every single conduct evaluation of your kids becomes part of your kid's permanent file from kindergarten till high school. And the federal government has already said it is their plan to make all those documents available to employers when your kids go to get jobs someday. This is a document the feds have produced, right, about the proper way to educate kids in the 21st century. If you open that document to the 43rd page, you see these. These are some of the ways they want to biologically meter your kids, not just ask them questions. You know, Bill Gates, is a partner in a company who is trying to create an MRI scan that you can use in classrooms. They want to do brain scans of your kids in the class. It's too big. Obviously, the machines are too expensive. But they want to create a basic MRI that they can begin to use to monitor your kids' brain waves in school. That's the kind of stuff that's going on. Oh, they want machines. And if you go back to this for a second, that's the thing that's so frustrating about this. And I think the point is that Bill Gates is not in this because he gives a rip about pedagogy. He's in it because he's a technocrat. What Bill Gates likes about all of this is the ability to manipulate people, control them, shape them through technology. I mean, why would that surprise us? He said it himself many times, that the future is a technological one where we use all of this data, all of this information to shape kids. You know, I remember when I was in high school, I didn't get any career counseling until I was a junior in high school. And then you had to take those little bubble exams. Remember those? I remember filling out my bubble exam. I was always supposed to be a farmer. I'd been the worst farmer in the world. But that, as bad as that was, I'll tell you, they're starting to career path your kids now in kindergarten. They're starting to give your kids tests at 5-year-olds. 5-year-olds give them quizzes and surveys to try to figure out where they belong. You understand, whether you think that's a good idea or not, I certainly don't. But that's what the Soviets did, right? This idea that you would right away figure out by the time kids were in middle school what their aptitudes were. And whether they liked it or not, that's where you put them.
It's like grading of livestock.
It's herding, it's grazing. I always like to point out to people, by the way, this building that they built in the Utah desert, the people of Utah are trying to pass a law to cut off water to that building. And that's a big deal because you built this federal government in the middle of a desert where it requires 4 million gallons of water a day just to cool all those computers in a desert. 4 million. And you remember that case in California where ranchers were being booted off their land because of the snail darter, that you couldn't irrigate your fields because of this little snail darter? All that water that they were saving for the snail darters, they've directed it to the Utah desert for projects like this. That's what's going on in your country right now. I'm going to jump to the very end, a couple of things. There are other things I could show you, and I know there's good stuff here, but I'm going to skip it because I want to go to the couple things to wrap up here. And if a lot of you have seen my videos, you can get this online free too. I want to play you this. We're back to this again. Why are we debating this? The people who did this are telling you why they're doing it. This is Secretary of Education Arne Duncan on the Charlie Rose Show in 2009. Listen to this brief interview clip.
I think our schools, let me walk through because this is a really, really important point. Let me start with a day first. I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
Yes, and let me tell you what, not just lengthening obviously the school day, but a wide variety of after-school activities, drama, arts, sports, chess, debate, academic enrichment, programs for parents, GED, ESL, family literacy nights, potluck dinners. At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. So I think we need the schools open much longer hours. And by the way, we don't have to do this all ourselves as educators. You can bring in great nonprofits, the YMCAs, the Boys and Girls Clubs, mentoring and tutoring groups to co-locate their services and better serve the community from the school. In every neighborhood in our country, you have schools. In every school, you have classrooms, you have computer labs, you have libraries, you have gyms, many have pools. Those buildings don't belong to you or I. They don't belong to the unions. They belong to the community. We have these great physical resources, and we need to maximize it.
So keep them open 12 hours a day, 12 months a year?
Yes.
12 hours a day, 12 months a year?
And I would go to 6 or 7 days a week, not just Monday through Friday.
7 days a week.
Schools
so
need
the
to be
school becomes a center of community life.
Where the school becomes a center of community life, great things are going to happen for those families and great things are going to happen for those children.
Then tell me why that hasn't happened before. I mean, who has stood in the way of that happening before?
Well, I think this is, again, pushing innovation, pushing change.
But who stood in the way of it?
I don't know if there's one person that stood in the way.
I don't mean an individual, but has it been an organization? Has it been an institution? No, has it to do with resources? Has it to do with a mindset about education?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a lack of creativity, and it's a lack of understanding what our children need. And again, this is where I think we've just been slow to react. If you go back 30 or 40 years ago, the average child could get out of school at 2:30, mom was at home, child would go home to mom, dad was working, and get a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at 2:30. Today you have more two-parent working families, you have more single moms working 2, 3 jobs, you have unfortunately many children going home to almost no parent families. So our society has changed, our schools have not kept pace, and this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we again have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative. What if the school system runs a school from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, and what if they give the school to a great nonprofit partner, the YMCAs, the Boys and Girls Clubs, whatever it might be, to run it from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock? Have all their resources go into better tutoring, better mentoring, and then bring in other nonprofits. The money that I spent on this to open our schools long in Chicago was arguably the best money I spent because it was so highly leveraged. And you had all these phenomenal partners coming in, working collectively and collaboratively to in one spot provide this vast array of academic, enrichment, social, even medical services to children and their families. So yes, you need resources to do that, but it's not just about resources. It's about thinking differently, partnering, collaborating, and understanding what our children need today to be successful.
When you were head of the Chicago school system,
there's a foundation of things that we have to do. Our children have to be fed. They have to be safe.
Nutritional meals.
Yes. Buildings have to be safe. They have to be able to see the blackboard. And so we fed tens of millions of meals a year to students. We did breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes it got critiqued for doing too much, but if children are hungry, they can't learn. We gave out tens of thousands of eyeglasses every single year. And again, maybe we shouldn't be in that business, but I would argue if a child can't see the blackboard, they can't learn. We tried to make sure our buildings were absolutely safe. And because if a child's worried about, can they get home after school or not, it's hard to concentrate in AP physics or biology. So there's a set of foundational things we need to do to meet the students' social and emotional needs. And again, the more we open our school buildings to the community, the more we work together, not just with our children, but the families, the more we create an environment where the students can maximize their academic potential.
Okay, but do I understand you to say?
What I saw all my life was children who happened to be desperately poor, who happened to come from very tough communities, who happened not to always have the most functional families, go on to do extraordinary things educationally because they had my mother and other people in their lives who helped them be successful. So what I understand in my heart and my bones, and what the president understands in his heart and his bones, and what the First Lady understands, is when we give our children, when we give our students real opportunities, the highest of expectations, and the support to get where they need to go, they can defy all the odds.
That he wants to institute, as part of his own educational philosophy, a new culture of accountability.
That's absolutely right.
Teachers specifically.
Broader. Teachers, students. The best line from the other speech, I got chills when he said it. He talked to students and said, when you drop out, you're not just giving up on yourself, you're giving up on the country. Powerful, powerful, powerful line. So he's challenging all of us to step up and to do more and hold ourselves mutually accountable. Students, parents, he said to parents, sorry to say this on a TV show, turn off those TVs at night. Spend time reading to your child. Do more. Go volunteer. Get to know your child's teacher. So he's asking all of us to do more. Traditional educators, parents, students, the business community, all of us. And what I came to understand as I got older, that literally the difference between those who lived and did well and those who died was education. I didn't have one friend who made it out and went to college who ended up getting killed. The students that dropped out, the students that didn't have the opportunity, they didn't make it. They literally didn't make it. And so this battle is about more than education. This is a battle for social justice. And that when we give those opportunities and when we stay with children, they can go on to be the Hollywood movie stars and the brain surgeons and the IBM leaders and the great educators. And when we don't, the consequences are absolutely devastating.
So he wants the schools open 12 hours a day, every day. He wants your kids to be fed breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the schools. He wants, did you hear what he said? When he slipped and called the schools stores? A very telling little faux pas. He also told you that we're starting to build clinics onto new construction high schools and middle schools. They want to be able to give your kids health care. Under the Obamacare health care law, the schools can now furnish your daughters, your underage daughters, with birth control. And it's unseemly. What the schools have been doing in some districts is driving young girls off campus and taking them to Planned Parenthood. That's a bad photo op. They're building clinics and pharmacies onto schools now so they can do it in-house. I'm going to end my talk, and we'll take just a couple minutes worth of classes. We need to be out of here no later than 3:30, and I've got to change still. So, and we've got somebody follow. Whoa, I forgot. You got the pastor. Do y'all know the pastor? You're in for a treat. I want you to. This guy is amazing. Can we stay and listen to him? We can. No. All right. See, I'm gonna hurry. You're in for a treat. I'm gonna leave you with this little story, and let me go to the end here and put up that. There's the web. If you want more of this information, go here. All this stuff I can give you for free. Every single slide you see today, I'll send it to you. It's all verified. But let me leave you with a little story, and then I'm going to turn it over to the pastor. What happened? I have a 12-year-old niece in Houston, Texas. This August, before the kids went back to school, a note went home from the school district in Texas, in her district, ordering all 12-year-old girls, all girls her age, had to have a gynecological exam on record with the school before they could come to classes in the fall. And what happened was my sister-in-law, she's got cancer and she's divorced, so she's under a lot of pressure. So she didn't know what to do. She sent her 12-year-old daughter to get a gynecological exam. The same way you take your 8-year-old kid to get a physical for his basketball, right? So she sent her. Well, after this really started to bother my sister-in-law, and she called me a couple weeks later. I wish you would have called me sooner. You know what they were doing, right? Under the health care law, your daughters can be given birth control or even abortion in the school. The schools can bring your daughter to an abortionist. If a 13-year-old girl is pregnant and she goes to one of her counselors, she goes to a school administrator's, and she wants help aborting that baby, the school can help her do that without consulting the mom and dad. But do you know what mistake the healthcare law made? I've gone through the whole thing. There's nowhere in the Obamacare healthcare law that requires 12-year-old girls to get examinations, because no doctor can prescribe birth control for your daughter. No school, nobody can give your daughter birth control until a doctor's examined her. So the healthcare law forgot to require that. So the schools can't really give your kids certain birth control if they haven't been examined. What that school district did, without telling the moms why they wanted it, is they got the gynecological exams on record for every 12-year-old girl in that school district, which means now, without consulting the moms and dads, they can give them anything they want. Without consulting the moms and they didn't tell the moms and dads why they required that. And in following up with the school district, 85% of moms submitted those documents on their daughters. Right?
That's what's wrong with our country today.
I'm going to stop here for various reasons. Thank you very much for listening to me today. You can get a hold of me here. If there's more you want to ask or talk about, let me know. Yeah, and the bottom line is, I'll leave you with this thought. Common Core, as I said before, it's not about education. The education stuff may or may not work. I'm pretty sure it's not going to work. The experts don't think it's going to work. What you will be left with, what this is going to be ultimately when it's all said and done, is sociology. It's about this moving your kids a different way. So I'm going to leave you with this. This is Dr. Mary Calamia. She is a clinical psychiatrist and child social worker from state of New York. In watching Common Core unfold in New York, horrible things started to happen. She's going to tell you, this is her testimony before the Senate Select Committee hearing about what dangers there are You've heard developmentally inappropriate. This is about the dangers that accrue to these kids.
Good afternoon. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm a psychotherapist. I work with parents, children, and about half of my caseload is teachers also. My caseload represents about 20 different school districts in Suffolk County. In the summer of 2012, my elementary school teachers started to report increased anxiety over having to learn 2 entirely new curricula for math and ELA. And that was when I first heard about the change to the curricula to a one-size-fits-all, taking the imagination and innovation out of the hands of the teachers. In the fall of 2012, my phone started ringing. I started getting an inordinate number of referrals of students, a lot of honors students, 8th graders mostly, who were self-mutilating. They were cutting themselves with sharp objects, and they were burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped. And I didn't know why. I asked the kids, and all they kept saying was, "We can't take the pressure, it's too much." I also started getting a lot of elementary school students referred to me. They were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and that school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset to the point of vomiting. I was hearing from parents about kids bringing home homework they couldn't help them with. I was alarmed to hear that in some cases there were no textbooks for the parents to look at, and they had no idea what their children were learning. The teachers were reporting a staggering level of anxiety and depression, and that was when I first heard the term Common Core and learned about the standards that we now say set the bar so high anyone can walk right under it. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, my patients were increasing their self-mutilating behaviors. They were complaining of insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. I don't know of any formal studies that connect these symptoms to the Common Core, but I really don't think we need to sacrifice an entire generation of children just to get the correlation. The Common Core and high-stakes testing is creating a hostile working environment for teachers and consequently a hostile learning environment for students. When I first heard about the Common Core, APPR, and high-stakes testing, my first thought was, who is going to rate the parents? I see children and teenagers who are exhausted, running from activity to activity, living on fast food, then texting, using social media, and playing games well into the wee hours of the morning on school nights. We have children taking cell phones into the classrooms, tweeting and texting each other all day. We have parents, and yes, parents, who are texting their children during the school day. Let's add in bullying and cyberbullying that torments our children, even to the point of suicide, and the interminable drug problem that we have. And these variables affect student performance, and we make the teachers responsible for their performance. The SED holds them accountable, substituting innovation and individualism with cookie-cutter standards, believing that's going to fix our schools. We can't regulate biology. Young children cannot engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That would require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that is not fully functional until adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking, rational decision-making, and abstract thought, all things that the Common Core requires prematurely. We give children pre-assessments, tell them to succeed, and then give them tests on material they haven't learned and tell them it's okay to fail. They cannot resolve that mixed message. Last spring, a 6-year-old encountered a multiplication sign on the NWEA first grade math exam and asked the teacher what it was. The teacher was not allowed to help him and told him to just do his best. From that point on, the student's test performance went downhill. He couldn't shake off the unfamiliar symbol and couldn't believe his teacher wouldn't help him. The Common Core requires children to read informational texts that are owned by a handful of corporations. They don't have a filter to distinguish good information from bad. So whatever you put in front of them, they take that as gospel. They're literal. So when we give them a textbook that explains the Second Amendment as, the people have the right to keep and bear arms in a state militia, they will look no further for clarification. We ask them to write critically using emotionally charged language to persuade instead of inform. They don't have that functional prefrontal cortex. So they tap into their limbic system, which is the part of the brain that involves basic human emotions, anger and fear being the foremost. So when we ask them to use emotionally charged language, we're actually asking them to fuel their language with fear and anger and aggression. They cannot temper this judgment. They don't have the ability to do that. So we teach to the test, which I think doesn't really measure learning. I think the tests measure endurance and resilience. Only a child who can sit still for 90 minutes, come back the next day and do it again, and the next day again, can succeed. I'm going to introduce you to a couple, I'm almost done. I'm going to introduce you just a couple of student stories, okay? A couple of the faces of the Common Core. We have an entire third grade class that spent the entire day sobbing after one testing session. A second grader who witnessed this is now in third grade and won't go to school. She's being evaluated, a 7-year-old being evaluated for psychotropic medication just to get her to go to school. A 6-year-old who came home crying because in September, in the first grade, she didn't know what a vertex was. 2 8-year-olds opted out of the ELA exam and were publicly denied cookies because the teacher gave them to the class but wouldn't give them to them. And that teacher, who under duress, felt obligated to do such a thing. A 6th grader who once aspired to be a writer but now won't do it because we do it all day long, even in math. And a mother who has to leave work early because her son is hysterical over his math homework, and his CPA grandfather who's babysitting for him can't even help him do it. And countless other kids who are refusing to go to school, feel stupid, and now are completely turned off to education. I will conclude with this one thought. Our country became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. This isn't rocket science. It doesn't take a great deal of technology or corporate or government involvement to help our children to succeed. We need to rethink the Common Core and the associated high-stakes testing and get back to the business of educating our children in a safe, healthy, and productive manner. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your opinions on this with us today, because this really is, I think, part of the crux of the issue. We can talk a lot about the educational standards and reaching certain standards and everything, but these are human beings. They're not robots. The teachers aren't robots. And if it was as simple as some might want to make it to be, maybe that's what we would have, robots teaching the kids or something like that, because when a child gets discouraged about education, we've lost them at that point. And until we get them back on track, they're just not going to learn the same. They're not going to absorb the information. So I think it's very important that you added that, to add your voice today. Just one quick question. As I've talked to a lot of my constituents, we heard a lot about the testing last spring, and now what I'm hearing a lot about is a kid that most years goes to school, they're excited about a new school year, and now we're ramping up the instruction, because as we know, we started with teaching something, testing something that the children have been taught, but now we're getting into the teaching side of it and the rapid pace of it, and teachers not feeling like they have the ability to slow it down to make sure all the children are absorbing the information. So I'm just wondering, if you've seen any type of different impact from the testing itself as opposed to the pace of the instruction.
The testing, at testing time, I can say that my kids and my teachers were in a total anxiety state. The kids were a wreck. And no matter how many times we sat down and told them they're not really testing you, that scores aren't going to count, this is really about seeing how much you've learned and how well the teachers, it just didn't matter. The kids were an absolute wreck. And I didn't really know about the Common Core last September, but when they were taking the pre-tests and coming in and they kept telling me, I'm taking my final exams on material. Kids who were taking Spanish were looking at a language they didn't even know, and I was baffled, and they were baffled, and I just didn't even know what to say to them at that point. But the anxiety level around September and March, April, when the tests were being given, through the roof. Not sleeping, stomach ache, I don't want to go. Parents who were opting out their kids but terrified to opt their kids out. It was just, and the teachers were a wreck.
Okay, thank you, Al.
Is this on?
There you go.
Okay. Now, in your profession, you've taken courses on child development, and you've been exposed to some of the questions or the curriculum that the kids are going to, that they're supposed to be able to handle, correct?
Yes.
Have you looked at some of the curriculum?
Yes, I have.
And you've
mostly the math I've seen.
Right, and you study, and you know, in attaining your degree, you studied child development.
Yes, that is correct.
And are you finding that what they're asking these kids to do is developmentally, you know, appropriate for these children?
I strongly believe that a lot of it is developmentally inappropriate. To especially this this focus on persuasion and persuasive writing and arguing basically is developmentally inappropriate. When a child's prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, they tap into the limbic system. The limbic system is fully, it's like primal, it's basic, and it's really fully charged by the flight or fight, you know, adrenaline rush, anger, fear, and that's what they tap into. And so that's where we see all of the anxiety, and that's where we see a lot of acting out behaviors.
Okay.
They can't persuade at that age.
Yeah. Percentage-wise, how big of an increase have you seen with kids coming into your office?
Oh, it's at least doubled. At least doubled, if not more.
And are you seeing teachers also?
Yes.
And what's the percentage of an increase of teachers that you're now?
I would not say I've had a percentage increase in teachers referred to me. I've had a percentage increase, or I've seen a huge increase in their symptomology. I've had teachers who were almost ready for discharge, who are now medicated, who are, you know, stepping up their therapy, had them maybe down to every other week, who have now had to increase to weekly sessions. So you know, there's most definitely a strain on them. Usually come August, I start to hear kids and teachers saying to me, you know, I'm starting to get bored, I'm getting ready to go back. This August, they were, you know, I don't want to go back. Teachers sick to their stomachs about having to go back to work.
Okay, and now these children with the self-mutilization, did they have a history of that before
No,
this?
no prior history. I mean, I've had children who were self-mutilating. This is not a new phenomenon. It's the sheer volume of the number of kids that were coming into my practice, and it wasn't just from one school with one kid teaching other kids. It was coming from every district. And my office is in Stony Brook. I service at least 20 different districts. And every district, every middle school, high school, you know, junior highs in some districts. It wasn't unique to one school.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.